Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is week 8. So we're studying chapter 7 this week, and the chapter title is East and West in the Grip of the Cold War, and there's a quiz this week which is due on Sunday night. And so we're going to talk about the Cold War a little bit. It's pretty easy. It's a short chapter, and the quiz is really easy, and I'll go through the quiz with you as well. The funny thing about this for me is, I lived through, a lot of the Cold War, so I kind of know what it was growing up, what it was like growing up during the Cold War, and like duck and cover drills we used to do in school to get prepared for nuclear attack. So this would be in like the 60s, and there were civil defense shelters, and some of you, well, probably none of you are older than me, but some of you either know of this stuff or have witnessed it, like I have. So anyway, we're going to talk about the Cold War, and the context for this whole thing is that, in the last chapter we read about World War II, and when World War II ended, there was this big void in Europe because that's where all of the battles were fought. That's where Germany fought the Russians on the Eastern Front for Eastern Europe and fought the Allies on the Western Front for Western Europe. And so if you recall, there was a Grand Alliance, and the alliance was the U.S. and the U.K. and other Allied forces, France, all of the other European countries, along with the Soviet Union, who fought against the Germans in World War II. So the Grand Alliance is really the U.S., U.K., and the USSR. And after World War II ended and the Germans were defeated, troops were in all of these areas. So the giant Soviet Red Army was in Eastern Europe, and I'll talk about the Red Army here in a little bit. And the Allied forces were in Western Europe. And so when the war ended, that's where everybody stayed. And there was a Yalta conference and a Yalta agreement. I think on the cover of this module I have a picture of that with Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. So, there was this Yalta agreement that we were all going to kind of get along, but it really collapsed right away because Stalin being communist and the USSR having this communist ideology, they wanted to keep the territory that they had conquered from the Germans. And in a way, they had every right to, because the Red Army and the Russians lost far more people than like the U.S. or the Allies did. And if it wasn't for the Red Army, World War II would not have been won the way it was. There was no way the Allies could have done it on their own. So the Red Army was a powerful force. The USSR had spent a lot in blood and treasure, if you will, and they felt like they deserved to keep all of those areas in Eastern Europe. And of course, if they were going to do that, those areas were going to be under communist control. So that's sort of where this is going in 1947, 1948, as soon as the war ends. And then on the flip side of that, the Allied forces, mainly France, the UK, and the US, they're like, hey, we're gonna keep the West. We're gonna influence West. So we're gonna maintain this democratic capitalism in Western Europe. And the U.S. eventually goes as far to come up with this thing called the Marshall Plan, and maybe I'll get to that later in the lecture. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I just wanted to set it up for you that the Soviet Union has all of Eastern Europe because that's what they took during World War II, and the Allies have everything in Western Europe. And when that sets up, everything that was talked about in the Yalta Conference starts to collapse. In other words, there's not going to be democratic republics in Eastern Europe, even though Stalin said, oh yeah, we can do that. There was no way that was going to happen. So right away there was trouble, and basically what happened, these two camps emerge, and it's, by camps, just two factions emerge. And the factions are the USSR and the US for all practical purposes. And it is the beginning of the Cold War. So the Cold War has several elements to it. And one of them is, it was an ideological war in the sense that it was really the communist versus the capitalist, and that's the way most of the world leaders and politicians looked at it. But in addition to being an ideological war, it was also a nuclear arms race because, obviously the U.S., developed the first atomic bombs, drop them in Japan to end the war in the Pacific, and then, I think 1949, the Soviet Union detonates an atomic bomb. So now there's this nuclear arms race. So the nuclear arms race is a big part of the Cold War. And, why is it a Cold War? What's the difference between a Cold War and a hot war? Well, the Cold War is sort of the name that journalists and politicians and historians have named it. But what it really means is, in a sense, not a bullet was fired. In other words, the U.S. and the USSR never went to battle directly with each other. Now, there were proxy wars and other things that we'll get to, but there was no direct confrontation. So it wasn't a hot war, it was a Cold War. So that's why the name is what it is. So that's sort of the preamble to what we're talking about, and I'll just go through some of the bullet points from the reading, and then we'll quickly go through the quiz questions and get you on your way. So, one of the things that the book talks about, and if you grew up in this era, you've heard of the term the Iron Curtain. And if you're a little kid, you're like, wow, is there really like an Iron Curtain somewhere when you go over there? And no, there's not. The Iron Curtain was actually a phrase that Winston Churchill came up with, actually when he was lecturing in a college in Missouri. But this Iron Curtain is this idea that there's a dividing line between Eastern and Western Europe, and it's this Iron Curtain, so it was just a metaphor. But anything on the other side of the Iron Curtain is communist, and that's how they talked about it. So if you read that, that's what it is, and you'll read about these two hostile camps, so the U.S. and the USSR. And part of the deal is that, the Soviet Union always wants to expand their sphere of influence. All of these countries that are sort of reeling in physical and economic damage after World War II, they're looking for someone to help them out. So it's easy for Stalin to go and say, hey, we'll take care of you, but let me talk to you about communism. You might be interested in this. So the Soviet Union always wanted to expand because they wanted more territory, and because also they wanted to create a buffer zone between them and these other capitalist or Western European countries. So this idea of communist spread, the domino effect, some people called it, was something the U.S. Didn't want to have happen. So the U.S. came up with this doctrine of containment. And what that meant is that we're going to contain communism where it's already at, in Eastern Europe and Hungary, Yugoslavia, Poland, the USSR, the Balkans, some of those areas. We're going to contain it where it's at. So if you read about something called containment, that's what they're talking about. Let me get a drink. Thanks. So we talked about the Marshall Plan a little bit, and the U.S. developed the Marshall Plan, which was like a $13 billion plan, which was real money back then, and to be given to Western Europe or any nations who wanted to rebuild after the war. And the Soviets didn't like that at all, because they were like, hey, the U.S. is bribing these countries with money to side with them. And I don't think there was any mystery. The U.S. was definitely doing that, but that's what the Marshall Plan is. And, Germany gets divided between East and West Germany. Like there's a wall, the Berlin Wall. All of you have heard of that. So that's a result of this Cold War early on. And then NATO is formed, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is still around today. And it's really sort of a group of the good guys. So, Canada, U.S., UK, the other Western European countries, and it's an agreement that if any of these countries get attacked, it's an attack on all of them. So NATO is real powerful because it sort of keeps the Soviet Union at bay. But in response to that, the Soviet Union creates something called the Warsaw Pact, which was the same kind of thing, only with all of these communist countries. So, again, these tensions are increasing all the time because of these different treaties and different attempts to influence other countries to side with the communist or the capitalist. So there's that. So that's that part. The book talks about Cold War in Asia. The two biggies there, I guess, is that Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist, is defeated by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, who's eventually led by Mao Zedong. And I don't remember what we covered in the last chapter or not, but Mao was successful because he had recruited all of these peasants to be on the side of the communists. So it was easy to overthrow the existing regime, the nationalist regime. So under Chairman Mao, China goes communist, and then the Soviets and China reach an agreement, a mutual security agreement in 1950. So that's really scary for the U.S. because now China and the Soviet Union or Russia or, whatever you want to call it, USSR, now they're together, and here's this huge communist force that is moving forward to influence Asia. So that's sort of problematic. And what happens is a couple of things. So first, let me talk about Korea. So Japan controlled Korea during World War II, and after Japan was defeated, the Soviet Union and the U.S. split Korea at the halfway point, and so Korea is split into North Korea and South Korea. North Korea being communist, South Korea not being communist. And in the 50s, this skirmish breaks out between the communists and the non-communists, and the UN forces go in, so that's the U.S. and many other allies, and the Korean War begins between the North Koreans and really the Americans. And it's not really a war, it's actually a police action. It was never declared a war, but that's another story. But that's part of the Cold War in Asia. So we have China going communist, we have the beginning of the Korean War, and then the next thing is that a guy named Ho Chi Minh, who's down in Indochina, which is Vietnam, if you guys are familiar with that area. Ho Chi Minh is a communist organizer and revolutionary, and he becomes successful in North Vietnam, taking over North Vietnam for the Communist Party and also Central Vietnam. So that's going to set us up with what's to come in the next section. So those are the Asia things. Again, all of these things are related to the Cold War and communism versus capitalism. And that's what this chapter is about, the whole deal. So again, ideology, meaning communism or capitalism, and also nuclear arms race, expansion, containment. Those are sort of the big themes here. So as we move on, I already mentioned the Soviet Union detonates their own atomic bomb in 1949. And there's a map in this chapter, map 7.7, and you should look at it because it shows you like where all of the missiles were at for each side. And if you ever go out west, like in the U.S., you go out to Montana, out that way, I've been there many times, you can see old missile silos, and you can see areas where current missile silos are at. So this stuff is all real. It's pretty cool. Well, it's not cool, but it's out there. So what else is happening in the 50s and 60s as part of the Cold War? There's McCarthyism and Red Scares in the U.S., so, U.S. social, U.S. culture is affected by the Cold War in that there's Red Scares. I mentioned these duck and cover drills in schools and, bomb drills in schools when I was growing up, so that's all part of it. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis hits. And, I write in my notes, which you will read after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I say, holy blank. I won't swear on the air. But, the bottom line is that Fidel Castro takes over Cuba, through a revolution, and the country goes communist. And one of our spy planes in the early 60s, when Kennedy's president, sees some missiles on the island. And it turns out they're nuclear missiles, 90 miles away from the U.S. So that's this huge crisis, and again, that exacerbates tensions even more. And Kennedy brilliantly creates a blockade, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, settles down without any major catastrophe, which is amazing. But I think, as a historian, when you look at the Cold War, probably the Cuban Missile Crisis was maybe the point where we were closest to some sort of nuclear holocaust, if you will. So it's something to think about. It's an interesting read. There's a movie out there, I think it's called 13 Days with Kevin Costner. It's one of my favorite movies. I may watch it after this lecture, and it's all about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's really cool. If I could get it for free on the site, I'd put it on the site. But so that's that. And then Kennedy's assassinated, of course, and Lyndon Johnson takes over as president in 63, and the Vietnam thing starts to be a problem because Ho Chi Minh is going farther south, and Johnson decides to bomb North Vietnam, and so begins the first stage of the Vietnam War. And not to spend any time on the war, but the communists end up winning the Vietnam War. I mean, the Americans, with all of their power and all of their bombs and all of their might, could not defeat a ragtag bunch of communists. So actually, the communists win the Vietnam War, and over 40,000 American soldiers are killed in the process for really nothing. So, there's that. But I think there's a quiz question that says, what does the Korean War and the Vietnam War have in common? Or do they have anything in common? Were they fought for the same reasons? And the answer is yes, because they were both fought, between this idea of we don't want communism to spread. So there's that. And then finally, in the end, the Cold War actually is really dying down after the missile crisis and after Vietnam in the 70s. But then when Ronald Reagan gets into office in the 1980s, he is like a real commie hater, for lack of a better word. His administration is very hawkish, and they don't tolerate communism at all. So the Cold War starts to kind of flare up during that time, and there's increased defense spending. There's the development of SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is basically the Star Wars system that would shoot missiles out of the sky with killer beams. And I don't think they ever got it to work, but I'm sure they're still working on it. And then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, basically because their economy collapsed, and the wall is torn down in Berlin, and the societies start to open. Germany reunifies. I don't think we're there yet. I think that's in the next chapter. But the Cold War pretty much ends, but I would argue that it really hasn't, because Russia still has all these missiles. We still have all these missiles. They're communists, we're not. So the Cold War officially, maybe as a historical construct, ended, but as far as the de facto, the stuff that's really happening, I mean, come on, we're still at it all the time. Russia's developing these magic weapons. We're doing this, they're doing that. We have the Space Force now. So, there's a lot of stuff still going on. But anyway, that's the long and short of it. Let me go through the quiz really quick. Sorry this has taken so long. One of your fellow students said, "Hey, Dr. Dan, you should make your lectures longer." So if you can find out who that is and say, "Hey, shut up," that's cool. But anyway, so here's the quiz. So the first one says the Cold War was based largely on, and it's asking you to pick something. So just read through this and keep in mind, the differences between the U.S. and the USSR and some of the reasons for the Cold War. So keep this idea of it was primarily ideological in nature, and you'll do fine. And then the next question asks why Vietnam was fought. So when you think about that question, you want to think about this idea of communism and the U.S. not wanting it to spread. So you can figure that out once you read it. And then another question is one of these where you pick several answers, and it talks about Cold War tensions and how were they exacerbated, how were they increased. And so there are 3 answers out of the 4 that are correct. So pick the correct 3 and you'll be good to go. And then there's a couple of true and falses. So we talked a little bit about the Korean War and the Vietnam War and what they had in common, so keep that in mind. And then also there's a question about Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party, so be careful with that one. And that's it for this week, so have a great week. Be safe. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a good day. Take care now. Bye-bye.